Hey everyone, and welcome to the second Pillar of Garbage Patreon community video. Basically, every month my Patreon supporters get to suggest and vote on a topic for me to cover. And this time, the winning suggestion was to look into writer Christopher Yost's work across Avengers, Earth's Mightiest Heroes and the MCU, to see if there were any common thematic elements between these properties. And I thought the best way to do this topic justice was to fold it into a sort of mini-series I'm doing about all things Asgardian across EMH and the MCU. The first video of which went up a few days ago, link on screen now. And what I want to talk about specifically this time isn't so much the characters of this corner of the Marvel universe, but the places, the settings, Asgard and the Nine Realms, how these properties portray them differently, and how comparing them may allow us to see more clearly the sometimes troubling ways that Asgardian rule is depicted and celebrated. We see Asgard and the other Norse realms a few times across the course of Earth's Mightiest Heroes, and each time it's pretty impressive. These settings are vibrant, detailed, and full of intriguing designs and architecture which make them feel alive and different from the other settings of this show. And there's a reason for this. In a YouTube interview last year with Chainsaw Reacts, which I'll link in the description, Avengers EMH producer Joshua Fine spoke a little about the development process for the show's settings. Essentially, because of the micro episodes which open up season 1, the EMH team had to brainstorm and design like 5 times as many settings and worlds as they would have done otherwise.
Because we have to create Iron Man's whole world and his whole cast of supporting characters and his environments, and then we have to do the same thing for Hulk, and then we have to...
Given this process, it's no surprise that Asgard and the rest of Thor's world looks so good. It's like the old Kirby drawings got upscaled, the gaps filled in with a glossy future Norse paint job. And in episodes like Thor's introduction, we get to see the nooks and crannies of Asgard, not just the palace and the throne room. The Asgard episodes were always some of my favourites when I was younger, and a lot of this comes down to the uniqueness of the setting. But this uniqueness extends beyond pure aesthetics. By making these realms so different, so non-human and non-earthly, the show also creates opportunities for action and dramatic moments which would be impossible in a more terrestrial story. For instance, we see Hulk in a world of Hulks, we see our human heroes deal with problems on a monstrous scale, and we see Hawkeye on horseback. This guy's deal is that he's a dude using a truly antiquated weapon, the bow and arrow, in a world which has completely eclipsed it. But through the setting of Vanaheim, the show is able to put this anachronistic warrior in a fantastical setting uniquely suited to his abilities. So yeah, in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, we see a vibrant and well-utilised version of Asgard and the Nine Realms, both of which make permissible some really engaging situations. But there is a caveat here, because this backdrop of Asgard, with its detailed visual design and inventive storyboarding, is essentially just that, a backdrop. The flip side of this cartoon form is that there's never really an opportunity to treat these places as anything more than this. We don't really get into the histories of these places, the power balance and imbalances, and the culture of any of these different races. To be clear, I'm just talking about Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes here. I'm not considering Thor Tales of Asgard or anything like this, because we're trying to keep to Yost's work in this video, on EMH and in the MCU. But largely speaking, these realms, these people, they're not particularly three-dimensional. And because the show doesn't really dive into the details, it's pretty tricky to analyse them. What's the nature of Asgardian rule? How does it reflect real-world systems of governance? And what messages might it be sending? We can't really know, because with perhaps one exception we'll return to later, these episodes don't give us a clear picture of these societies. But that's sort of inevitable, given the conventions and limitations of the cartoon format. These are 22-minute episodes, starring an ensemble cast. Each one has to tell its own story, with a beginning, middle, and end, with character development and action sequences along the way. In a show like Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, it's a lot harder to integrate detail, culture, history, and political ideas within a setting which shows up a handful of times a season, so it doesn't really happen. But in a feature film, you've got a bit more space to play with, so let's take a look at the MCU, and the pretty different way that Thor's realms are presented. So, Yost worked on the Thor sequels too. He's credited as a writer on The Dark World and Ragnarok, thus there's some amount of shared DNA with the Asgard of Earth's Mightiest Heroes, and while it's difficult to tell precisely what Yost contributed, I think this link creates grounds for comparison. The first point to make is that in the MCU Thor franchise, Asgard changes quite a bit between films. In Thor 1, it's sleek and space age, combining sci-fi aesthetics with Norse-inspired architecture, but in The Dark World, it's a lot more medieval. Gone are the weird floating space blocks, for instance, and even this medieval grit is de-emphasized by the time of Ragnarok, with its curiously flat and washed out vision of Thor's home, which tends more towards a generic post-Lord of the Rings fantasy vibe. But this protean shifting goes beyond the visual, because what Asgard represents, and the way these films engage with ideas of empire and authority, these change just as much as Asgard's look over the course of the Thor films, and particularly the two which Yost worked on. I've spoken a little previously about the way Asgard and her enemies in the first two Thor films present somewhat contradictory political narratives, with the Frost Giants suggesting a depth and perhaps a flawed humanity to those we're conditioned to view as enemies, and the Dark Elves sort of doing the opposite. But the framing of these narratives is complicated if we consider the way these places, these realms, are depicted, because Jotunheim and Svartalfheim appear desolated, seemingly by war, and in both cases, the war in question was fought against Asgard. Now, we don't know much about the history of these conflicts, but it does appear that in the MCU, Asgard's authority over these realms is based upon and maintained through military dominance. And even in the less wrecked realms, Asgard appears to quell discontent primarily through violence, even in the seemingly benevolent time period of Asgard's history in which these films are set. The thing is, these first two films don't seem particularly interested in teasing out the implications of what appears to be an Asgardian militaristic imperial past. Asgard and her authority are presented as fundamentally just in these films. Even when the Dark World criticizes Odin's hunger for revenge, the reason for this criticism appears to be the human cost of Asgard's soldiers, not any larger critique of imperial power or its violent enforcement.
If and when he comes, his men will fall on 10,000 Asgardian blades.
And how many of our men shall fall on theirs?
As many as are needed!
I had a couple of comments on my last video, which attempted to reframe the plot of the Dark World in order to rehabilitate Malekith, but there's really nothing in the film, in its depiction of Asgard and its relationship with its apparent subject world of Svartalfheim, which is conducive to such a reading. You really have to read against the grain in Thor 1 and 2 to find any material whatsoever which suggests Asgardian imperialism is fundamentally unjust, and that's what it is, imperialism. Edward Said, in Culture and Imperialism, defines imperialism as the practice, the theory, and the attitudes of a dominating metropolitan centre ruling a distant territory. So pretty much what we see in these films. And the Thor franchise, initially at least, seems on board with this. The peace achieved through dominance seems to legitimize Asgard's rule, and the first two Thor films aren't really interested in nuancing the matter any further. You're encouraged to be as uncritical of Asgard's imperialism and the essential legitimacy of its rule as Thor or the Warriors 3. And if you happen to notice the other realms, the way they don't seem as content or lively or as rich as Asgard, then that's just too bad. But things changed a little with Ragnarok. Not entirely and not overwhelmingly, but enough that it provides an interesting counterpoint to the MCU's depiction of these realms and their governance up to this point. And I think part of this might be due to Yost's writing work on the script. Reports suggest that he and Craig Kyle were responsible for a dark, apocalyptic first draft of the script, which was brightened up a bit by director Taika Waititi. As I suggested above, it's often very difficult to look at a finished script and be able to anatomize it, to be able to see which bits came from which writer specifically, but I think it's fair to assume that Yost had a greater hand in the Asgard Hela storyline and scenes compared to the Sakaar stuff, many elements of which seem very Taika-esque, some of which we know to be the product of on-set improvisation rather than scripting, so we'll focus less on that side of things for this section, which kind of works well given the thematic through line we've been taking so far. I've talked previously about the way most MCU films tend to gesture towards progressive ideals, while actually reinforcing an essentially conservative, socially hierarchical status quo. And there's something of this to Ragnarok, but it's not as straightforward as with the other films in the franchise, because the film does shatter the illusion of Asgard's legitimacy in a way the previous two never even approached.
Odin, proud to have it, shamed of how we got it. We were unstoppable. I was his weapon in the conquest that built Asgard's empire.
How do you narratively utilize Empire within a nominally progressive framework? Well, it seems to me that there are two main options. You either detach it from reality, or you dismantle it. To depict Asgard and the Nine Realms in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, Yost, Fine and co chose the former option. These places and their inhabitants are so fantastic, so non-human, and, by virtue of being animated, so clearly not real, that the relative lack of detail we get regarding the system of Asgardian dominance is a far less pressing issue, but the MCU comparatively is too realist to get away with this. Look, I'm not saying that the Marvel films are realist from a genre standpoint, but the films do attempt to ground their more outrageous elements more firmly than is normal for comics or animation. We can see this in the Thor franchise. These settings, Asgard and the Nine Realms, aren't inherently linked mystical dimensions as they appear to be in EMH. They're planets in space, united by conquest, and their inhabitants are greatly humanized. As a result, when we see it in live action, in this more grounded universe, Asgard's domain doesn't look like a fantasy. It looks like an empire. And if you've been paying attention to society in the last few decades or so, you might have noticed that, generally speaking, we've finally decided that empires are bad. And even a film franchise which tends to covertly reinforce capitalist and neoliberal ideas kind of has to concede, eventually, that this is the case. So, in the films at least, Asgard sort of had to go. This isn't a Ragnarok video specifically, so I'm summarising, but the third Thor film doesn't merely destroy Asgard physically, it also makes explicit the bloody military roots of Asgard's rule, and establishes that, like real-world metropolises, its wealth and splendour are due to the fruits of its imperial holdings. On a character level, this dark original sin of Asgard is represented by Hela, and by the film's end she is destroyed along with the metropole itself. One could even argue that the power and allies Thor found on the waste-yard planet of Sakaar represent a sort of imperial empathy on Thor's part, that by getting to grips with and affirming the value of places and peoples on the bottom rung of the galactic ladder of authority, Thor becomes more able to see the illegitimacy of his imperial homeland. All in all, things change in Ragnarok. Asgard's imperialism, as well as the value placed in it by our hero, faces its end, and injustice fundamentally changing is a rare thing in the faux progressive climaxes of the MCU. There are some caveats here. Thor remains king, so while Asgard's imperialism is condemned, its hierarchical system remains intact. In addition to this, even after Asgard's physical destruction, Thor's Asgard-derived power remains, suggesting there exists in this reality some transcendental power of Asgard beyond the physical, a notion which comes troublingly close to the very supremacist ideas the film's earlier sections had attempted to dispel. Do these factors negate the film's other progressive, anti-imperial gestures? I don't know, but at least this film, unlike its predecessors, is one over which we can ask such questions. Again, it's hard to know how much of this direction came from the film's writers and how much came from other places. Ragnarok stars a number of Australians, and Taika Waititi himself is a New Zealander. These are cultures shaped by colonialism and imperialism, both historically and in an ongoing sense, but as suggested above, I think we can definitely attribute some of this thematic questioning to Chris Yost and Craig Kyle. The thing is, though, this potentially progressive spark only survives if you stop watching at Thor Ragnarok, because Avengers Infinity War kind of walks back a lot of the symbolic impact of Ragnarok's climax. Thor's journey in that film can be read pretty easily as an affirmation of Asgardian imperialism, because to defeat Thanos, all One Eye here goes to a previously unseen imperial holding of the Asgardian crown, Nidavellir, and charges its one surviving inhabitant to manufacture goods for him. What we see here then is that Thor still holds onto the authority granted to him by Asgardian imperialism, using it to obtain what is essentially a colonial product, Stormbreaker, since we learn that the dwarves of Nidavellir are historically the weaponsmiths for Asgard, their rulers. With this interaction in mind then, the events of Ragnarok don't seem to have made any fundamental changes to Thor's understanding of Empire or his place in it, and that's quite a shame, especially since I think Earth's Mightiest Heroes depicted a similar situation in a better way. See, Thor also goes to Eitri in a time of need to forge Stormbreaker in the cartoon. Not for himself in this, mind you, but still, look at the power dynamics in this scene.
You come to me for help. Where were the Asgardians when Surtur escaped?
Eitri, Odin himself has sent us with—
Odin? Odin promised his protection.
This Eitri is not some broken Imperial subject. This Eitri has authority unto himself, able to resist requests from the Allfather. Eventually he strikes a bargain with Thor, one Thor is less than happy with, and similarly in the season 1 finale, he only crafted Tony's Uru suit on the condition that it would remain with the dwarves. And when we bear this in mind, other moments in the show seem to corroborate this idea of some amount of realmly autonomy. The Asgardians of Earth's Mightiest Heroes, for instance, are far less dismissive of Midgardians than their MCU counterparts.
You have our respect. To the mightiest heroes in the 9 realms, Hail Avengers! Hail Avengers!
I'm entering into conjecture here, but from these hints I get the impression that the Asgardian primacy in Earth's Mightiest Heroes' 9 realms resembles a military empire less, and some sort of league more. We've already noted that the realms are less homogeneous in the cartoon, and figures like Eitri suggest that they also hold a greater measure of autonomy. Goods and products aren't extracted by Asgard from Nidavellir, for instance, they're bought and traded, sometimes on less than favourable terms. And Asgard's dominance appears not as a matter of conquest, but of alliances and protections pledged. So at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I think I prefer the vision of the Asgardian realms that we see in this show over the frankly problematic imperialism of the MCU. That being said, if you don't go on to watch Infinity War afterwards, there are at the very least elements to admire in Ragnarok's critique of imperialism. And while some of that can be credited to the voices of the director, perhaps actors and producers, and likely Craig Kyle as well, I think there's reason to imagine Yost is responsible, in part, for these elements. And this reason all comes down to Thor himself. Because if you look at Thor, as written by Yost, in both EMH and the latter 2 Thor films, it becomes apparent that Thor, as envisioned by Yost, is a fundamentally just character, even in comparison to other heroes. He's selfless and altruistic across these projects, and repeatedly we see him able to self-reflect and abandon flawed ideals. That's why the episode Powerless fell flat for some EMH viewers, because unlike the version of the character we saw in the first MCU film, this Thor was already plenty humble. And when you put a Thor this just, this worthy, in a world where Asgard sort of isn't, eventually he's going to turn his back on Asgard's imperialism. At the end of the day, it's quite hard to analyse Asgard's potentially imperialist rule in these projects as well as in wider Marvel fiction, because all of these depictions reflect pre-modern mythology. When stories of Asgard and Vanaheim, the dwarves and the elves and the Aesir were first being told, the tellers of these stories understood ideas of rule, war, of social structure in ways completely alien to our modern perspectives. So every new depiction of these places and systems, even filtered through comics, is pretty much guaranteed to be strange in some way to our modern sensibilities. Perhaps the difference here is that the MCU tries to transform this pre-modernity into a more realistic, modern, grounded vision, whereas Earth's Mightiest Heroes doesn't so much, and is content for this mythic material to remain a little more weird and arcane. I think you could probably trace back most of the issues and differences I've talked about today to that general point of divergence. And if this is the case, it's perhaps a sobering reflection on our current economic frameworks that to modernise Asgard is to cast it as an imperial hegemon, one which continues to extract goods from dominated peoples. The point I want to end on then is that even though stories of Thor and Asgard are adapting older, sometimes ancient material, that doesn't mean that modern depictions of these settings are ideologically neutral. Because as I hope I've shown, even 2 near-contemporary representations of the 9 realms differ greatly, from the perspectives of narrative, aesthetics, and even politics. And while the MCU's Asgardian setting is thematically questionable at times, I think we see in Ragnarok for the first time a willingness to interrogate this setting, and the implicit ideological loads it bears. And given the perhaps more equitable version of this setting we see in Earth's Mightiest Heroes, I think it's fair to credit Yost in part for this willingness. And I think now, more than ever, we should be amplifying media and writers which interrogate imperialism in fiction. So that's that, the February Patreon community video. Thanks to Ian Fifield for suggesting the idea at the heart of this video, and thanks to my patrons for picking it. It's always trickier to write a video which I didn't come up with myself, so I hope this satisfies. If you want to help pick the topic for the next community video, or get access to the March Patreon exclusive video, which will probably be out in a week or so, then consider joining up, links below. But otherwise, thanks everyone for watching. Drop a like if you're feeling generous, and big thanks to all those patrons on screen now, especially Ian Fifield.